All right, so today we're talking about the difference between education and pedagogy. And to help us really get into it, unpack this whole thing, we have a guest with us. We have Tori Klein, who's an attorney and a homeschool mom. Tori, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you guys for having me back on.
I think it's going to be a really good conversation. The starting point for our deep dive today is this article. It's called Education or Pedagogy. It's from the Journal of Philosophy of Education, and the author is Geoffrey Hinchliffe. Our mission today is to break down Hinchliffe's main arguments and then see how they line up with your experiences. Tori, both as a lawyer, where I imagine understanding concepts like really deeply is super important, and also as someone who's right in the thick of it with education because you're homeschooling your kids. So right off the bat, the article points out this thing that we do.
Right.
We use education and pedagogy almost like they're the same thing. And Hinchliffe is, hold on a sec, let's actually treat these as separate ideas. So I guess that's where we should start.
The phrase that really jumps out at me is worthwhile activities and ways of life. Because immediately I'm thinking, worthwhile to who? What we decide is valuable kind of shapes the whole purpose of education.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he goes on to say that education is about growing things like good judgment, that ability to think for yourself and like really engage thoughtfully with everything around you. He even brings up this guy Peter's criteria, saying that for something to be truly educational, it's got to be worthwhile. It has to involve like real understanding, and it needs to be intentionally passed on. Tori, I'm curious, hearing this kind of broader view of education, does it resonate with your approach to homeschooling your kids? When you think about what's worthwhile for them to learn, what does that look like in your world?
For sure, it resonates a lot for me and for us. The term worthwhile, right? It's not just academics or subject matter. It's about much more. Academics are important, but about character building, instilling senses of responsibility, a sense of purpose, belief in themselves to do things independently, getting them to understand how to learn. What do you guys think?
Sparking that love of learning that hopefully will stick with them their whole lives so they can navigate like anything that life throws at them. We want them to be equipped, not just with facts, but also the wisdom to know how to use them, how to contribute, to make a difference.
It's interesting how you talk about that love of learning, like that intrinsic motivation seems like such a core part of this broader idea of education. It's almost an end in itself, not just a way to get to something else.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got this idea of education being this big, expansive thing. Now let's turn to pedagogy. So Hinchliffe defines pedagogy as the actual nuts and bolts of teaching, the theories behind it and the actual practices, like the methods, the techniques we use to share knowledge and help people learn new skills. It's much more focused, almost like instrumental.
If we think of education as the destination, then pedagogy is the map and the car. It's about how effectively and how efficiently we get that information across and help someone develop new skills.
You're spot on. He really draws the line between aims of education, like those big picture goals, and then the tools of pedagogy, which are how we try to hit those goals. So pedagogy, I guess, is in service of education, but it's not the same thing. For example, we tried a few different ways, a few different programs at my house. So structured programs that had more memorization seemed to be great for that, except for they lacked a lot of deeper understanding. They weren't that enthusiastic about the material, and some of the things I really wish that they retained were not retained. So then we changed to more hands-on methods, a lot of discussion, and I use a lot of AI to help me figure out the best ways specifically for my kids at their specific ages and academic ability level.
What's so interesting is that a certain teaching style or method might become like super popular, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone's really checked to see if it lines up with those bigger educational goals. Makes you wonder if we sometimes just grab onto the newest teaching fad without really thinking about how it impacts a student's overall development.
That's a great point. And that leads us to this potential conflict that Hinchliffe brings up. He says that if we focus too much on pedagogy, we might actually lose sight of the big picture of education. If we're only thinking about the techniques, we might miss out on the actual content and the overall growth of the person learning. He's saying that good pedagogy needs to be guided by a clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve educationally. Without that, all the fancy teaching methods in the world are just directionless.
It's like having the newest GPS, but not knowing where you want to go. You might have the most efficient route, but it's meaningless if it's not taking you to where you want to be.
Exactly. And he's also concerned that if we see pedagogy as purely a tool, just a means to an end, we might become too focused on the things that are easy to measure, like test scores and things like that. And that narrow focus could come at the cost of the less quantifiable parts of education, like critical thinking and real understanding. So, Tori, as a lawyer where critical thinking and really understanding complex ideas is essential, have you seen this tension play out between teaching methods and building those deeper intellectual skills?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in law, you can't just memorize statutes and cases. It's really good to do, but you have to be able to break them down, understand the principles behind them, and then, more importantly, be able to apply them in some tricky or complex situations. I've met people who have gone through really rigorous academic programs, but yet they still struggle with a deeper level of analysis. They had trouble forming strong arguments and some even basic arguments. I've also been there. Homeschooling has led me to re-educate myself. And it seems like other people focus really on mastering specific techniques to do well on exams rather than really fostering that intellectual curiosity and honing in on independent and critical thinking. So they've got this cool toolbox that's full of techniques, but they don't understand when and how to use them in which situation.
That toolbox analogy is really good. It highlights how pedagogy without that grounding in educational aims can be like having a bunch of tools but not knowing what you're building.
Yeah, that's perfect. Hinchliffe also reminds us that education isn't something that only happens in school. It's a lifelong thing that happens everywhere. And homeschooling, Tori, is a perfect example of education thriving outside of a traditional classroom. How do you see this distinction between education, the what and why, and pedagogy, the how, working in your homeschooling? Is that something you consciously try to balance?
Yeah, it's something we're always thinking about because we have the freedom and the responsibility to shape our kids' learning, right? So we have to start with the goals. I know I had to, because otherwise I would have been lost. I thought, okay, what do I want them to understand? What values are important to us? What kind of thinkers do we want them to hopefully become? And then I had to go look for teaching methods that aligned with that or supported those goals. If something isn't working, I had to give myself freedom to just drop it. If it's not fostering the understanding I want them, or it's killing their curiosity or love of learning, we had to switch gears. I've had to do this several times in the last 4 or 5 years and just try something different. It's really a constant process of trying to align the how of our teaching with that what and why of their education.
That adaptability and focus on matching methods with goals seem really important. It suggests that in any learning environment, there should be that constant reflection on why we're learning in the first place and using that to choose the best approaches.
The article encourages all educators, whether they're in a classroom or homeschooling, to really consider the ultimate goals of their work and to make sure that how they're teaching is actually helping them reach those goals. It also suggests that learners should be aware of this distinction too, like understanding that education is more than just passively absorbing information through whatever methods are being used. Tori, for other parents out there, whether they homeschool or send their kids to traditional schools, what's one takeaway from this discussion about the difference between education and pedagogy that you think is most valuable?
I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is always that why at the forefront of your educational journey, not just for a parent or educator, but also for the kid or the student. If they know why they're learning what they're doing, they're more invested, they're going to understand its application beyond memorization, beyond just the little technique that's tied into how you write an essay, right? It's so easy to get bogged down in curriculum, schedules, testing, all of that. But if we can take a step back and ask, what do we really want our kids to get from education? And what kind of people do we want them to be? It helps us have this bigger educational goal in sight and helps us make better choices about how we teach and how we expect others to teach our children. I'll say this one thing. In Climbing Parnassus, Tracy Lee Simmons talked about the true aim of education is to develop the man and woman who are something bigger and finer than a mere piece of mechanism. If everyone believed that in education, I think we have a very different world right now. So I hope everyone thinks about that as they move forward.
Focusing on the why is like a compass.
Right.
It guides educational choices beyond just immediate results or what's trendy. It brings everything back to the individual learner and how they develop as a person.
Tori, your perspective has been so valuable today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It has been my pleasure, as always. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to more conversations with you guys.
We hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a new way of thinking about these core concepts. Maybe think about how this difference between education and pedagogy shows up in your own learning or how you're involved in the education of others. What does education really mean to you? And how well do the ways we teach serve those bigger goals in your experience? See you next time.